as I write about in my book, the events of 9/11 really triggered sort of a double grieving for people who are Muslim, South Asian, Arab, Sikh immigrants in the United States. Obviously, we were grieving for what happened on that day, for the horrendous attacks and the losses that our country suffered. But very soon after the attacks, we were also in a grieving process because we began to hear about reports of individuals who were being targeted, Sikh men being chased down streets in New York City, being called terrorists, Muslim girls who wore hijab being asked by their teachers to remove them so that they could return home safely. And this particular picture is actually of a press conference that was held about 4 days after 9/11 at the Japanese American Memorial in Washington, D.C., where we came together at that location for a very specific reason, to send a message to our country, to our government, to not repeat the mistakes that we had done during World War II. Sadly, Asian American community activists came together again just about 4 months ago in December at that same site to send a similar message because of the unprecedented backlash that we've been seeing since the attacks in Paris and San Bernardino. But that moment, the 9/11 moment, and the weeks and months afterwards were, for me, a call to action to use the privileges that I had to be in service to my community, and that's what led me to SALT, South Asian Americans Leading Together, which is a national nonprofit organization, where we were at the simultaneously building internal capacity in our communities and understanding how to be in solidarity with other communities of color while dealing with significant external crises that were all connected to the post 9/11 backlash. And so those experiences, the 15 years after 9/11, are really what led me to want to write this book. And this book really is focused on some of the lived experiences of South Asian, Muslim, Arab, and Sikh immigrants in the 15 years after 9/11. Some of the goals in the book, really quickly, are first to really give a little bit of a more fleshed out understanding of what it means to live in post 9/11 America, that it's a daily phenomenon for many people of living in fear, feeling that they are targeted. But it's also a call to action for the communities that I write about, for Muslim, South Asian, Arab, and Sikh immigrant communities, to really center our racial identities and our racial solidarities, especially as our country's demographics so quickly change. And it's a conversation starter, I hope, for us to actually talk about race more openly, more honestly, and to do so in intersectional ways. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which the past 15 years have really led to, I think, what we're seeing today. And the post 9/11 backlash that I write about really manifested itself in 3 different ways. Interpersonal actions of discrimination and bias, as well as institutional governmental racism, and of course, political and media discourse. So this is a picture of the brother of Balbir Singh Sodhi, whom I'm sure many of you will recall was the first Sikh American to be killed after 9/11 as he was planting flowers outside of his gas station in Mesa, Arizona. And he was just the first. And many people think that the post 9/11 backlash is limited in scope to those first few weeks and months after 9/11, but it's not. As the next picture shows, you will also, I'm sure, remember the picture of these 3 young students, these 3 young Arab American students who were killed in North Carolina just about a year and a half ago. Or Sunando Sen, who you might recall was a Hindu and Indian man who was pushed into the subway tracks right here in New York City, who died in 2012. So these are people who lost their lives to hate violence in our country. And the hate violence also includes violence towards places of worship, places that should be the most safe and sacrosanct, but we are seeing at mosques, at temples, and gurdwaras, as I'll talk about later, actually being sites of potential attack. So beyond the interpersonal ways and interactions that we have seen the backlash manifest is, of course, the institutional ways that it does, right? So many of us, I'm sure, are familiar with the government policies that were enacted and implemented. Some we're more familiar with than others. And for example, whether it's the NSEERS or special registration program, or whether it's surveillance at the local level especially here in New York City, or if it's at the federal level with racial and ethnic mapping of neighborhoods and the continuing violent extremism program. All of these programs have come together to create a climate of fear and suspicion and to really push forward this belief that anyone who is Muslim or perceived to be Muslim is either a terrorist or a terrorist in waiting. It also happens in terms of actual institutions. So we see profiling happening in airports and airlines. This is a picture of Waris Ahluwalia, who's a Sikh American actor who was who was not allowed to board a plane a couple of months ago because he was perceived to be suspicious, as well as even in our school systems. I'm sure that many of you will recall Ahmed Mohammed, the young Muslim teenager who brought in a homemade clock, right, to school, and it was immediately perceived to be a bomb. So whether it's airports or the school system or even government policies, our communities are continually under threat and suspicion. And the third way in which this backlash is really manifested is in political discourse and in media narratives. And I'm sure that all of us are becoming accustomed to seeing signs like these, sadly, right? Get out of our country. This message that immigrants are not wanted, that refugees should be blocked from coming to our shores, and that America has been invaded. So we are starting to see, again, a resurgence of laws and policies, initiatives that are trying to take away the rights of many immigrants and refugees because of the growing political discourse in this country that is xenophobic, anti-immigrant, and of course, Islamophobic. And the message that it sends to our communities at the end of the day is that it's not our country, right? And so I wanted to kind of give folks a very quick overview of those three ways in which we have seen the backlash manifest over the past 15 years. And when we get into conversation, we'll talk a little bit about what the impact has been on communities in particular, these communities that I write about. But I wanted to now read to you a couple of passages from my book that show the intersection of when racial anxiety, when xenophobia, and when Islamophobia come together all at once. This is a couple of passages from the first chapter of the book. It's called Not Our American Dream, and it relates to the massacre that happened at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. It was early on a Sunday morning in August 2012, and Paramjit Kaur Saini was going about her morning routine. Her sons, 20-year-old Kamal and 18-year-old Harpreet, wanted to sleep in a little bit longer. So Paramjit set out on her own to the local Gurdwara, the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. Paramjit was a familiar presence at the Gurdwara, which had become a second home to her family and to many other Sikhs in Oak Creek, which is a small city located in the outskirts of Milwaukee. The Gurdwara, built in 2007 on 13 acres of land, was built by Sikh immigrants. On weekends, Sikh families would gather at the Gurdwara to pray and connect with one another. The dining hall was always filled with the sounds of people socializing and children laughing during langar, which is a free meal offered to anyone who came to the Gurdwara. Kamal and Harpreet usually hung out with their friends and played football on Sundays at the Gurdwara, while their mother helped in the kitchen and the prayer hall. But August 5th, 2012 would not turn out to be a normal Sunday for Paramjit's family or for the Oak Creek community. Soon after his mother had left the house, news reached Kamal that people inside the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin were in danger. Details were scarce, and panic-stricken, Kamal rushed to the Gurdwara to find that law enforcement vehicles had blocked off the driveway. Authorities asked Kamal to wait across the street in the parking lot of a bowling alley, where he joined others also anxiously searching for information. While waiting there, Kamal and others speculated about what might be happening inside the Gurdwara. They wondered, did a dispute between community members go awry? Then their close friend Kirandeep received a call from her father, who was inside. He whispered to her that he was hiding in the pantry of the kitchen because he had heard gunshots. He was one of around 25 people, huddled, terrified, among bags of rice and fresh vegetables. Kirandeep's father told her not to come to the Gurdwara under any circumstances. As the day wore on, many of the people who had been inside were allowed to leave, and a fuller picture began to emerge about the rampage that had occurred inside the Gurdwara that Sunday morning. Not seeing his mother and becoming increasingly anxious about her safety, Kamal left the parking lot. He called his friends. Together, they went from hospital to hospital, hoping that Paramjit had been brought to one. It would be a full 11 hours before authorities finally notified Kamal that his mother had been one of 6 people fatally shot inside the Gurdwara. When I first found out, I passed out, Kamal told me. I woke up in an ambulance and immediately thought of my little brother. Telling him was the hardest thing that I've ever done. This was not the future that Paramjit had envisioned for her family when she and her 2 sons moved to America from India in 2004 to join her husband, who owned a number of gas stations in Wisconsin. It wasn't the life that Paramjit had planned to build when she mustered up the courage just a few years later to begin working at a medical factory in a nearby town. Paramjit's determination to care for her family is a point of deep pride for her sons. 45 days after his mother was killed, Harpreet spoke about her in testimony before the United States Senate. He said, "My mother was a brilliant woman, a reasonable woman. Everyone knew she was smart, but she never had the chance to get a formal education. She couldn't. As a hardworking immigrant, she had to work long hours to feed her family, to get her sons educated, to help us achieve our American dreams. This was more important to her than anything else. But now she's gone because of a man who hated her because she wasn't his color or his religion. She was an American, but this was not our American dream." So I wonder if we could just take a moment of silence for the community in Oak Creek and all victims of hate violence. Thank you. The rest of the chapter on Oak Creek goes on to talk about how hate violence is not new in our communities, how it has existed since the Bellingham riots in 1907 to the assault on Rishi Maharaj, a young teenager right here in Queens, to, of course, what has been happening to our communities post 9/11. And it also talks about how hate crimes are classified legally in our country and what we need to do to come up with community responses to address it and hopefully prevent it. So the book is challenging and difficult in terms of bringing up issues like this, but where I found the hope and the inspiration to continue writing was really in the voices of young people who populate this book and who populate our communities all over the country. People like Kamal, who I spoke about, but also people like Faiza, who actually used to work at the Arab American Association of New York and was a visible actor in dealing with the Park 51 crisis here in New York City. Or Droost, who is a young Kurdish Muslim refugee who lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and has been dealing with the onslaught against Muslim and immigrant communities there. Or Yves Gomes, who's an undocumented Indian American who has been raising his own voice and pushing forward his own story of detention and deportation to raise awareness in our communities about the immigration system. And these young people are disruptors and they're bridge builders. And so they disrupt narratives that we have become accustomed to. And then that's the next picture will show you about saying we're not your model minority, right? They also are working at intersections of various movements. So proclaiming that we are Desi and queer and that we are also undocumented. This is Bhupin, who also appears in the book, who is undocumented, gay, Fijian American who lives in Los Angeles. And it also looks at how our communities are organizing people. Desi's Rising Up and Moving, it's this picture here, a group right here in Queens, as you likely know, organizing working class and documented people to actually build power in community to address and push back against policies like racial and religious profiling. And what is also happening in our communities is a solidarity movement. And that has in particular been something that we have seen highlighted, especially with the movement for Black Lives. And South Asian, Arab, Muslim communities are standing strong in support of the movement for Black Lives. And I think that we're still in the process of figuring out how to do it, right? How can we be more than bystander supporters? How can we do more than show up with signs, right? What can we be doing to address anti-Black racism in our own communities, to build the connections between the war on crime and the war on terror? So these are the types of conversations and dialogues and disruptions that we're seeing in our communities in terms of the solidarity movements as well. And so I want to point out two quick examples of, to me, where solidarity really looks like. This is going to take us back to Oak Creek, Wisconsin. When I attended the memorial service last August in Oak Creek, I noticed that many of the young people there were holding pictures of not just the Sikhs who had died in Oak Creek, but also of African Americans who had been killed by another white supremacist in a church in South Carolina just months ago. And that sort of connection of saying that we are connected in pain, but we are also connected in terms of justice and standing together is something that has been repeatedly happening in our communities. And this next picture is actually in front of the mosque in Murfreesboro, which I also write about in my book, where Black Latino leaders came together with Muslim, South Asian, Arab leaders to show solidarity and support and to make those links between histories of oppression and also how we challenge those oppressions. So I want to end by giving you a call to action. I think that most of you have a postcard on your chair, so if you flip to the back of it, you'll see that I'm asking folks who are moved by what you hear or read to take a pledge of action yourselves, right? That adage that change begins with each of us. And I've been thinking about and talking a lot about Dr. King's message of the fierce urgency of now, that we can no longer wait for others, we can no longer sit back, right? It is each of us who has to attend to what is happening in our country and our communities. So an acronym that I've been using a lot is BUILD, building bridges, understanding shared values and histories, informing and being informed, leading with language of solidarity, and of course, my favorite word, disrupting the status quo of narratives. And on the next slide, there are a couple of examples of how people around the country have responded to those postcards, or on those postcards. So if you are moved to do that, I ask you to put down your pledge, and you can actually also put down your name and your mailing address and give me those postcards back. And in a couple of months, I will send them back to you to remind you of your pledge and to connect you to any resources that I can. But folks say things like, the hardest thing, I will have conversations with my family members about Islamophobia, right? I will build relationships with local places of worship. I will ask my elected officials to take a pledge to refrain from using divisive rhetoric. So these are all ways in which individually or structurally or institutionally we can start to take a stance to disrupt the climate of fear, the climate of suspicion that exists, and to build more multiracial and inclusive communities for all of us. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. I'm going to turn it over to Hina, and we're going to engage in a conversation and reflect a little bit on some of the themes that I've talked about, and then looking forward to hearing from all of you to hear your thoughts and your questions as well. Thank you.